Here's one more factoid, because somebody put this out on Twitter. Jerry Lawler, who still wrestles occasionally, actually wrestled Lou Thez, who debuted in 1935. And they said nobody else can make that claim. I got another one for him. Mike Jackson. Mike Jackson from Alabama still wrestles every once in a while at some of these fan fests and shows. And he also wrestled Lou Thez when he was a job guy in Tennessee in the early 70s. And Thez was working there. So that's 67 years between two generations. That ain't bad.
You know, the Jerry Graham thing, while I'm certain he learned a lot of the respect he had, as zany as he was, for wrestling from Jim Londos and a lot of those guys when he came up, I wonder how much of modern wrestling psychology, or what was wrestling psychology, actually originates with him.
Yeah, well, he was
a hypnotist. I have photos galore of him doing hypnosis on people, like these displays and storefronts and everything. So, I mean, he was obviously beyond wrestling into manipulating people's minds.
Well, and he was a, lunatic genius, right? In that he had alcohol issues and he had mental illness. But at the same time, he was one of the pivotal figures in the 50s there that got heat everywhere he went. And thing is, you got to remember, at that time, here he is, he's a hypnotist. He's got to have and he was a promo, and he had a big personality and great patter, verbal ability. TV interviews are brand new. When he first gets his spot in the first main event spot he had in Atlanta in 55, 56, television is new. It's only been around for 6 or 7 years. And so TV promos were new. And most of the old timers that had never even seen television, much less been on it, they couldn't talk. They'd never had to. They could draw their pictures in the ring. But here comes Jerry Graham, and he's braggadocious and he's colorful. And whenever he wasn't 400 pounds, he looked good. But he always had a brother to do the work for him, it seems like. He got Eddie, then he got Luke.
Well, after a certain point, yeah, definitely.
To a certain, when he got big and heavy. But the mind,
Yeah, I mean, there would have been no Garden Riot without him. Forget about how much they love Rocca. Forget about the fact Dick the Bruiser was there. It was Jerry Graham bleeding, causing trouble. That's what it was.
Well, and also because the story is out there that, Jerry Graham had told people years later, well, Rocca didn't like to bleed, and I thought he should get some blood. I think he fucking bladed Rocca against his will. If you go back and look at the newspaper accounts from the sports writers that always sat at ringside and in New York kind of rolled their eyes at wrestling, every single one of them says something to the effect of something went wrong and these guys were really going at it. And I don't know that Rocca was ever that convincing of a worker. I think Jerry Graham did the job and said, well, fuck, this guy needs to get some juice for me, and did it. And then Rocca went crazy and got on Graham, and then Graham did it to himself, and then he's gushing blood, and then here come the people in the fucking ring, and they start setting shit on fire.
Hey, if I was in a fight like that, if I started a riot and they had one person to pick to watch my back, Dick the Bruiser may be the guy.
Yeah. And all the sports writers said, my God, he was just grabbing people and they'd come in the ring and he'd throw them out the other side.
But that's the thing about Jerry Graham, and it's one of the big mysteries, and unfortunately there's no one to talk to really. How much of what Eddie Graham learned came from Jerry Graham as opposed to Dory Funk Sr. or anyone else? Just psychology-wise, or what to do in the ring, how much actually came from Jerry Graham?
I think Eddie learned from everybody. And I think a lot of that came from Jerry because he had already been on top. Eddie Graham had only been featured on top in Texas as Rip Rogers. There was a previous Dutch Mantel and a previous Rip Rogers in Texas. And he had that, main event run, but he was still young. But the thing about Eddie Graham was he never even graduated high school. He had like a grade school education, was poor, from Chattanooga, Tennessee, but he was smart to life. He was street smart and life smart. And here's another thing I found interesting. Eddie Gossett had wrestled in the Florida territory in 1952 and again in 1955, I think, right before he went to Texas. And if you go back and look, and again, Scott Teal, thank you for the research, but if you go back and look at some of the results and clippings from Florida in the 40s and 50s, it was never a big money territory. The crowds in Tampa in the 40s and 50s were 1,500 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people. If a national star dropped in, 2,500 people. And but in the 40s and 50s, with the exception of Miami Beach, which already had some cachet as a place where rich folks went, there were no theme parks. There were no major interstates. Florida was a swamp. And there were the cities, but not like it is today. And wrestling had never been, it had been a steady thing, but never a big money territory. In 1960, Florida may have been one of the smallest money territories in the United States as far as wrestling. But when Eddie Graham has spent 2 years as the top heel tag team in New York, making all that money, where does he go after that? He could have gone anywhere. The Grahams against Rocca and Perez on one day in 1959 at the Garden sold out 22,000 tickets in advance. That was the old Garden. 22,000 tickets in advance, and it turned up to 10,000 away, according to the newspapers, between people couldn't get tickets that week and people that came that night. So that means that every promoter in wrestling would have known, if I get the Graham brothers, their mega box office, or either one of them, if they didn't want Jerry because of the issues. But Eddie Graham goes directly from New York to one of the smallest money territories in the business because he saw opportunity. He knew that he could go down there. He'd already seen the territory. He'd already seen the lay of the land. I think this had to be a concerted effort on his part. Maybe, who knows, maybe even Vince Sr. sent him down there.
That's what I was going to say. Don't forget that him and Vince Sr. always had a great relationship. It starts there, but always had a great relationship.
It lasted until Vince Sr.'s death, which was 3 years before Eddie's. Because in the early 70s, Florida TV was on in New York, and Vince Sr. was bringing Florida talent up to put them in the Garden, including Eddie and Mike Graham and Jack Briscoe and Steve Kern and blah, blah, blah.
He actually only died a year before Eddie.
I thought Vince Sr. died in 82.
No, he died in 84, and then Eddie died
in 84, sold in 82.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Nevertheless, so Eddie Graham made a conscious effort to go down there and become the top wrestling star on the cards, work with Cowboy Luttrell, who had ties to Texas, and then eventually bought into the promotion, 64, 65. He obviously was a good businessman. He saved his money. He was an alcoholic like Jerry, but he was a functioning alcoholic. Eddie Graham drank and had problems with drinking, but he still ran one of the most successful promotions in the history of the business. So I'm looking at it now like he knew what he was doing. And maybe even Vince Sr. sent him, said, you've seen the lay of the land. It's wide open. The promoter's old. It's never been a big money territory. You can expand it. So what did he do? He brought the same principles to Florida as he'd learned from Dory Funk Sr. in Texas, the Cal Farley Boys Ranch. He helped establish that in Florida for underprivileged and at-risk, young boys that needed a second chance. He was always contributing or raising money for local charities in the community in Florida. He was always getting awards from civic groups on television. Eddie Graham made wrestling in Florida not only a respected professional sport, and at the time, remember 60s and 70s, what pro sports teams did they have in Florida? And he had television in every market. And he was selling in the state of Florida in the good years, well over 1 million live event tickets a year in one state. I mean, my God, West Palm Beach was doing 125,000, 150,000 tickets a year. And he did all that pretty much from scratch with a territory that was barely there and that nobody really wanted to go to. And by the time he got finished with it, every top star in the business wanted to work there. You could make
but the money was
not,
the same.
Well, you could make money, but not as much money as you would make in some other places, because that was the trade-off. You got to live in Florida. The rats wore revealing clothing 12 months out of the year because of the weather. And you got to learn from Eddie Graham. And you would potentially, if you were good enough and he took you under his wing, you could be the NWA world champion. Because his was one of the most important votes for who got the NWA title. Jack Briscoe was his protege, a shooter. Eddie Graham always made sure that he had wrestling and athletes up and down the card until the main event. And then in the main event, he gave them the blood and the tables and the crazy and the wild and the dusty and the chain matches and Malenko and whatever, because he had already established this is a sport, this is a profession, it's legitimate, and these guys are crazy. And that worked. So it's amazing now to go back and look and say, and I finally put it together that one of the biggest drawing box office attractions in the business immediately left New York and went to probably the tiniest territory in the country at that time and completely transformed it.
A lot of it, too, I think, is about timing with TV and the power of TV.
That's something I've got to check back on. I don't even know what the TV situation was like in Florida at that point in time. But championship wrestling from Florida under Eddie Graham was in every market that had a television station in the state of Florida.
Or as the fans knew it, championship wrestling with Gordon Soley was in every market.
Yeah. Godden?
That's to me, that's the biggest Eddie Graham rule that I wish people would follow. You need serious commentators who speak to the audience in a way that they believe and who don't get physical with anyone. They have to be the credibility of the show. They have to be the anchor of the show. All this crazy shit happens in this crazy wrestling universe, but it's all real because the commentator is real.
Yeah.
But we get away from that. But to me, that's one of the most important Eddie Graham rules that I wish people would follow, and no one does.
I think I said this when we talked about the subject. The one place I never got to work that I would have loved to have, and just it didn't work out, was Florida, as long as Eddie Graham was running it. Because every Bill Watts, Dusty Rhodes, Kevin Sullivan, Jack Briscoe, on and on and on, everybody he had an influence on could do everything.
If you had come around just a few years earlier, you would have been exposed to Eddie Graham, Leo Garibaldi, Louis Tillett was still around.
Yeah.
You just missed a lot of those guys.
And actually, Eddie Graham was at Jerry Jarrett's housewarming party that I was at in 1982, and I was still a photographer. I'd not gotten to business yet, so I didn't have the courage to go up to him and say hello. That's the only time I was ever anywhere around him.
Was he at the bar?
There was not a bar in the house, but there was a bar out by the pool, and he was socializing there. Well, should we come back to modern times and depress ourselves now?
No, we shouldn't.
But unfortunately, it's our duty. What we're going to do is we're going to run through SmackDown, which occurred last night as we're recording this. And then because we talked about the disastrous necessity of Dynamite on Tuesday night this past week, we talked about that on the Drive-Thru and the ratings exodus that it produced. We will talk instead today for our AEW section on who the fuck is left. Who could possibly be a breakout star? Who could be pressed into service to right this ship as in creative or something? We're going to look at their roster and see what's going on. Do they have a little asterisk next to whoever's injured or hospitalized or in an iron lung?
No.
Or we're going to have to guess about that because they're not very forthcoming with that. Remember the WWE for a while there, anytime somebody got injured, they'd immediately report it. AEW, it is the exact opposite. You just don't see those people, but because there's so many of them, apparently they're embarrassed about it.
Do you think a wrestling company should publicly report injuries?
Well, it depends on, again, it's not necessarily a rule of thumb, but if somebody is used in a capacity, has been on television, and people are used to seeing them, and then suddenly, instead of them disappearing, because if they're hurt, you're not taking them off on purpose, you're taking them off because they can't wrestle. So you still want people to remember them and like them or whatever. So yes, if it's somebody important, I would definitely not only tell the injury, but try to keep giving updates on that person, because we don't want them to be forgotten about by the time they come back. And also it makes wrestling look, well, I started to say it used to make wrestling look more dangerous when you would report that a guy got injured and it was legitimate, but now I don't think anything can make this shit look more dangerous. But with Tony, people just disappear, and I know he's embarrassed because they have so many injuries to everybody. There's no reason preliminary people should ever be injured, except if they fuck up in practice. If you're having a match with a fucking preliminary guy and you're doing shit that's dangerous enough that somebody needs surgery, then you need to go back to fucking wrestling school.